It started with gruesome discoveries, remains found near the West Loop, then more evidence turning up in a vacant lot. Then came a torso dumped in a vacant lot. No name at first, but the streets whispered that a girl got shot for laughing. And suddenly, it all felt connected. The people behind it weren't the BDs, nor any of the usual crews the media loves to mention. These were crews whose danger didn't just lie with outsiders, but sometimes even circle back inward. The full story goes way back. Back in 1959, on a corner in North Lawndale, a group of young white and Latino teenagers were putting together something that would outlive them by decades. They called themselves the Satan Disciples, and it started off as a mix of street hustle, rebellion, and identity, not some grand criminal plan. The name, funny enough, came from a priest who once scolded some of the neighborhood kids and told them they were acting like the devil's disciples. That stuck, and by the time they settled on a mascot, a little red cartoon devil with horns, a pitchfork, and a long tail, they were deep enough in it to turn a joke into a full-blown crew. Their first territory was 15th and Tallman, and from there, they spread like fire. Within a year, they were already posted up near 18th in California, claiming parts of Pilsen and setting up in the near west side around Taylor and Racine. The original members were mostly Czech, Polish, and Mexican. But as the city changed and more Latinos moved into the area, the SDs turned into a mostly Mexican-American gang. By the mid-60s, it wasn't just street fights anymore. The Satan Disciples were known for going head-to-head with rival crews like the Ambros, the Latin Counts, and the Gaylords. Sometimes it was over turf, other times it was just about respect. They were young, impulsive, and drawn into a world where retaliation was constant. The newspaper clippings from the time tell the story. Shootouts on 18th Street, arrests after brawls in the park. Teenagers were being arrested with firepower far beyond what the streets should ever see. They might have started out small, but they had a certain energy that made them expand quick. Every corner they grabbed gave them more visibility, more numbers, and more heat from the cops and their rivals. The city was changing, and the SDs were changing with it. They didn't just stick to one hood, they were planting flags all over. By the mid-70s, the Satan Disciples weren't just another crew in the mix. They were building something bigger. Unlike some of the more chaotic gangs around them, the SDs had a structure. They had written constitutions, bylaws, codes of conduct, and even chain of command systems that they actually stuck to. The idea was to keep order in a world that was always on edge, a gang that moved like an organization, not just a bunch of wild shorties with pistols and pit bulls. Their ranks had older heads called veteranos who were running the business side. They handled the bigger drug connects, coordinated shipments, and made sure the corners were covered. The younger ones were the workers. They held down corners and kept eyes on the streets, moving according to orders from the top. It was a system built on loyalty, fear, and ambition. What made the SD spread even faster was something law enforcement later called familial transplant. A member gets locked up or his family moves out to the suburbs to get away from the chaos. But wherever they land, they bring that pitchfork with them. So by the early 2000s, the SDs had sets in over 40 cities in Illinois and even reached into 22 different states. And this wasn't no franchise model. These weren't off-brand versions. They had real ties back to Chicago. Same colors, same codes, same politics. The gang also formed key alliances. Around 1978, they officially linked up with the Folk Nation, putting them on the same side as the Gangster Disciples, Maniac Latin Disciples, and a few other crews. On top of that, they created a smaller alliance with the 2-6 and 2-2 boys, calling it the Insane Family. That move was all about survival, fewer internal beefs, more collective muscle to take on bigger threats like the Latin Kings. But behind all that unity talk, there were cracks. Discipline started slipping. The young ones coming in weren't built like the older generation. Some OGs started calling them EBK kids because they were down to slide on anybody, even their own. The rules that used to hold things together started getting ignored, and that's when the real blood started spilling, not just from enemies, but from inside the house. The same codes they built to protect themselves, they started twisting them, and that shift would lead to some of the most brutal, senseless killings the city had ever seen. Teodoro Baez was known on the West Side as King Mandingo, not just because of his size or presence, but because he carried himself like he ran everything around him. If you saw him in the early 2000s, chances are he was wearing sunglasses at night and always had at least one person watching his back. His closest homie back then was Juan Estrada, a fellow member of the Satan Disciples, who had been tight with him for years. People said they were like blood brothers, but in that world, loyalty can flip fast when money gets involved. By 2006, the relationship between Baez and Estrada had started to break down. Word on the block was that Estrada owed Baez over $11,000 from some street-level drug deals gone wrong. Baez started believing that Estrada was trying to flip the script, maybe even snitch, or turn the rest of the crew against him. Paranoia like that don't need much fuel in that kind of life. One wrong look, one whispered conversation, and it's enough to make somebody snap. On the night it happened, Estrada had pulled up to Baez's spot like it was any other night. He had no clue that Baez had already made up his mind about what was going to happen. The two got into it over the money, voices raised. Baez confronted Estrada, and what followed was a violent altercation that turned fatal, ending in a scene too brutal for even seasoned investigators to process. There was no rage left in Baez's face when he did it, just something cold and mechanical. Estrada's final moments were filled with confusion and betrayal, questions left unanswered. Baez reportedly told him it was because he tried to turn people against him. Once Estrada was gone, he tried to conceal the crime in the most chilling way imaginable, but then he made another move that chilled investigators to their core. He called upstairs and told his ex-girlfriend, 22-year-old Janet Mina, to come down. She lived in the same building, just one floor above. When she walked into the apartment, she didn't even make it to the living room. Baez attacked her without warning, killing her and placing her body beside Estrada's. The dismemberment continued that night. According to testimony, Baez spent hours in the apartment after the murders. Neighbors reported unsettling sounds, and soon bags began appearing across the city containing human remains. Over the next few days, body parts started turning up all over the city. A leg here, an arm there, stuffed in dumpsters and alleyways. Police arrested Baez after getting a tip from someone in the building. When they showed up, the apartment was a grim scene. Evidence of a violent act was everywhere, from cleaning supplies to hastily packed bags. Shaken called it the most horrible thing he had ever seen. Baez didn't resist. He just looked at the cops and said, "I'm tired." At the trial, the prosecution laid out every detail like a blueprint of madness. Photos, witnesses, the samurai sword itself. The judge, clearly disturbed, called it one of the most horrifying cases to ever come through their courtroom. Baez didn't say much in his own defense, and he didn't have to. The evidence spoke loud enough. They gave him life without parole. Some of the older gang members who heard the story said it wasn't just about the money or betrayal. They said Baez had started losing his grip, that he saw threats in places where there weren't any, that he was chasing control in a world where the rules had already collapsed. The aftermath was a grim reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. By the time Teodoro Baez got taken off the streets, the gang wasn't in any better shape than before. If anything, things were getting worse. The younger generation coming up behind him didn't have the same kind of structure or code. Instead, They were fueled by pride, paranoia, and the need to prove something to everyone watching. And for some of them, all it took was a look, a word, or even a laugh to pull the trigger. It was July 2010 in Little Village, a mostly Mexican neighborhood that had long been home turf for the Satan disciples. On that particular day, 18-year-old Jennifer Alvarado and her friend were sitting inside a car park outside her house on the 2400 block of South Spalding Avenue. It was supposed to be a normal afternoon. The girls were listening to music and talking, maybe laughing a little too loud for the wrong ears. That's when 20-year-old Luis Padin, an SD member known on the block for being aggressive, walked up to the car. It's not exactly clear what triggered him, but according to what her friend later told police, it seemed like Padden thought they were laughing at him. The girls reportedly said something along the lines of, "We're just girls," trying to de-escalate the tension. But that didn't matter. Padden suddenly fired into the vehicle without provocation. Jennifer was struck and critically injured. Her friend, in a panic, drove her straight to Mount Sinai Hospital, but it was already too late. Jennifer was pronounced dead shortly after. The neighborhood fell into shock. She wasn't in the gang, wasn't involved in the street life. She was just a girl, a regular girl, caught in the middle of something that should have never involved her. Patton didn't stick around after the shooting. He disappeared almost instantly, dipping out of the neighborhood and laying low for the next 3 years. But the case didn't die. The cops kept working it, and eventually, in 2013, Patton got picked up for another shooting in a different neighborhood. That arrest opened the door for a ballistics match on the gun used in Jennifer's killing. Once that connection was made, prosecutors moved fast. Patton was charged with first-degree murder, and by the time the trial was over, the jury didn't take long to convict. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Even in court, Patton never really gave a reason. He didn't say much at all. Jennifer's death didn't make national news. It didn't lead to protests or marches. But in Little Village, people remembered. Her friends posted up candles and photos on the corner. Her family stayed mostly quiet, choosing to mourn privately. And those who lived nearby said it felt like something had shifted after that day, like tensions had reached a boiling point where even small misunderstandings carried big consequences. After Jennifer Alvarado's murder, the atmosphere in Little Village started shifting in ways that weren't always visible from the outside. Among the younger SDs, the streets were getting even tenser. Retaliation became automatic. Respect wasn't something you earned over time anymore. You had to take it fast and show it in ways that made people remember your name. And with that mindset, it didn't take long for things to spiral again. The shooting of a girl, especially one who wasn't in the life, sparked whispers about how far the SDs were willing to go just to maintain face. People who were already uneasy started treating every look and word like it might be misinterpreted. Other gangs noticed the shift too, and soon after, gunshots started ringing out on blocks that hadn't heard them in months. Some were linked to Latin Kings, others to smaller independent crews that had problems with the SDs. But what they all had in common was a new kind of chaos. That chaos drew heat. Detectives started showing up more often, not just for the big crimes, but for every little thing. Street stops turned into house raids. Known associates started getting picked up on older charges. Police were building case files slowly, using every detail they could squeeze out of informants, surveillance, and cell phone data. Around this time, internal informants began to pose a serious threat to the gang's structure. Some lower-level members started cooperating with law enforcement to dodge charges or reduce time. That bred paranoia inside the sets. Meetings got moved around, phones got tossed, even some of the older guys started falling back, seeing too many young heads bringing attention they didn't know how to handle. The city launched a targeted gang initiative that focused on dismantling the Satan disciples set by set. Dozens of members were picked up between 2011 and 2014. They weren't just going after shooters. They went for the drug runners, the lookouts, and anyone holding rank. The strategy was to dismantle the operation at every level before it could rebuild. But even while cops were taking people off the streets, a different kind of split was already happening inside the gang, one that law enforcement couldn't control. By the mid-2010s, it became clear that the Satan disciples weren't one unified front anymore. The name still carried weight, but inside there were factions, crews that didn't always answer to each other, and sets that were more focused on their own blocks than the bigger picture. Part of that came from geography. Sets in suburbs like Cicero, Summit, and Aurora had different problems than the ones still in Chicago. Some were more focused on drug distribution, others on gun running, and others just on controlling whatever turf they had left. Without strong leadership from above, each clique started making its own rules. Then there were the generational differences. Older SDs raised under strict codes looked at the younger ones like they were playing a whole different game. The concept of checking in, earning stripes, or answering to a higher up started fading. Instead, clout became the currency. If you did something loud, something wild, something that made the news, you got respect, no matter who you hit or how reckless it was. That shift created open beefs between different SD sets. Some internal conflicts got so bad that they ended in shootouts between members wearing the same colors. In places like Joliet and Waukegan, there were documented cases of SD on SD violence where the only reason given was they were acting funny or they don't rep the set right. Those fractures gave law enforcement a roadmap, one piece at a time, but it also made things more dangerous for the communities caught in between. With no single person calling the shots, nobody could stop the next shooting once it got set in motion. Some old heads tried to pull younger members together, setting up private meetings or trying to pass down old rules. But by then, things had changed too much. The internet gave the new generation a way to move independently, setting up deals, beefs, and even alliances through encrypted apps with no need for old school sit-downs or face-to-face talks. The name Satan Disciples still meant something. But by the late 2010s, what it meant depended on who you asked and what part of the city you were standing in. While the older SDs were watching the structure fall apart, the streets were already grooming the next generation. But it wasn't happening on corners anymore, at least not at first. It was happening in middle schools, basketball courts, and even after-school programs. Young kids growing up in Little Village and suburbs like Cicero weren't getting recruited with promises of money or girls. They were getting pulled in by proximity, protection, and pressure. If your cousin was in it or your brother repped it, you were already halfway involved. Some joined to avoid getting jumped on the way home. Others wanted to be part of something that made them feel seen in neighborhoods where the only things louder than the gunshots were the helicopters hovering above. By the time they turned 14 or 15, most of these shorties already had a nickname, a clique, and a gun they could get to within minutes. The recruitment process wasn't formal, but it was effective. Older members would test a kid's loyalty by asking him to do little things: hold something, pass a message, deliver a package. If the kid came through without flinching, he was trusted with more. And if he did it with heart, he got a place in the circle. The problem was, these young ones came into the life with no memory of what the gang used to be. They didn't care about old rules, old alliances, or keeping peace with neighboring sets. For them, everything was personal. Everything was instant. And that mindset made the streets even more unpredictable than they already were. As the core leadership in Chicago struggled to hold things together, the influence of the Satan disciples was still expanding beyond city limits. Suburban and out-of-state sets began operating with growing autonomy, pushing the name in cities that had never heard of them 10 years prior. Places like Joliet, Rockford, and Elgin became active zones. Further out, sets popped up in Indiana, Wisconsin, Texas, and even as far as Georgia. But the farther they got from Chicago, the looser the connection became. Some newer sets had barely any contact with OGs from the city. They rocked the same colors, used the same symbols, and shouted the same phrases, but their actual ties were thin. That distance eroded the gang's identity. Without central leadership, these sets made up their own rules, beefed with who they wanted, and built alliances that would have never been allowed in the city. Some suburban SDs got deep into drug distribution, flipping opioids and pills through local high schools and clubs. Others focused more on gun running, taking advantage of weaker enforcement in rural areas to move weapons back into Chicago. In these towns, the SDs didn't need to be big to be feared. All they needed was one violent headline or a well-timed shooting to put everyone on alert. Local police departments weren't always prepared for what hit them. Many didn't even know what the Satan disciples were until bodies started dropping. By the time task forces were organized, the gang had already rooted itself in the community, not through numbers, but through presence. One or two key players in a small town could cause enough chaos to keep the whole place paranoid. And still, back in Chicago, the name kept bleeding out meaning. The streets were saturated with shooters, but very few leaders. The more sets that formed, the less control anyone had over them. By the end of 2010, the violence hadn't stopped, but the growth had. The Satan disciples weren't expanding the way they used to. With so many members locked up, dead, or laying low, the gang started losing momentum. And while the name still carried fear, it didn't move the same way it used to. A lot of that shift was tied to what was happening behind bars. SD members inside state and federal prisons started getting hit with long sentences that kept them out of the picture for decades. Some tried to maintain order from inside, but communication breakdowns and internal politics made that nearly impossible. Different prison blocks had different leaders, and sometimes those leaders didn't see eye to eye. Inside, SDs were forced into alliances that would have been unthinkable on the streets. In some facilities, they had to run with the folk nation. In others, they had to coexist with rivals to avoid larger threats. Those blurred lines confused the younger members who were entering the system for the first time, expecting things to be black and white. On the outside, this disorganization made the gang easier to target. Police kept chipping away at what was left, hitting sets with RICO charges, drug stings, and weapons busts. Some neighborhoods, once known as SD strongholds, now only had a handful of active members. Yet, despite the decline, the name never disappeared. The pitchfork tattoos still showed up in mugshots. The devil logos still popped up in graffiti tags across alleyways and train cars. The violence didn't vanish. It just got less predictable, more scattered, and harder to trace back to a single source. In the neighborhoods where the Satan disciples once moved like shadows, the loudest voices now come from the mothers. Women who used to whisper about their sons' whereabouts are now standing on corners holding posters, lighting candles, and naming names. Some of them lost their children to rival sets. Others lost theirs to friendly fire or internal beef. A few just lost them to the life altogether, vanished, locked up, or buried with no one left to visit the grave. Every few months, a memorial pops up on a block that had already seen too many. Plastic flowers, half-burnt candles, t-shirts with screen-printed faces. Some stay up for weeks before getting cleared out by city crews. Others disappear overnight, torn down by people who don't want the reminder. But in the homes behind those corners, the memory never leaves. Several community-led groups have tried stepping in to break the cycle, including old heads who once wore the pitchfork and now preach peace. Some hold meetings in church basements, others link up with nonprofits and try to get funding for after-school programs, job placement, or even just a safe space for kids to talk. The problem isn't a lack of effort, it's the silence that follows. A lot of people are tired, scared, or both, because even now, speaking up about SDs in the wrong setting can still get you touched. That fear didn't die with the decline. It just got quieter. The name Satan Disciples still exists, but the foundation it stood on has crumbled. What started in the 1960s as a structure set with rules, leadership, and a community presence became a scattered network of disconnected crews. Most of the original hierarchy is either dead or doing life. What remains are loose affiliations, smaller cliques operating under the same name, but rarely under the same principles. You still see younger guys throw up the sign or tag a wall, but ask them what the gang is really about, and the answers vary wildly. Some say it's about loyalty, others say it's survival, a few just say it's what they were born into. The meaning depends on who you ask and what they have lived through. Social media has also twisted the game. Members who used to avoid cameras now post videos, diss tracks, and live streams that expose entire operations in real time. The clout chase has replaced most of the discipline that once kept crews in line. What used to be handled in silence now plays out in front of the world, and law enforcement is always watching. For some, repping SD isn't about power, it's about identity, a legacy passed down like a last name. It doesn't matter if the structure is broken. What matters is that people know who you are, where you're from, and who you stand with, even if it's just you and a few homies left to claim it. When people ask if the Satan Disciples still run Chicago, the real answer is more complicated than yes or no. They still exist, but not in the way people remember. They no longer control entire neighborhoods the way they did in the 80s or 90s. There are still pockets of activity, especially in Little Village, Cicero, and certain suburbs, but those pockets are small, fragmented, and often in conflict with each other. There's no one left to call shots across the entire organization. No single voice unites the various crews. There's still a crown, but no king to wear it. And when a gang loses that level of structure, it stops being an organization and becomes something else entirely. A name without a body, a shadow of its former self, still capable of violence, but no longer capable of real power. Law enforcement knows this. That's why you rarely hear big indictments anymore. They don't need to target the SDs as a whole because there's no longer a whole to target. Instead, they go after the splinters, the independent sets, and the loudest shooters. And while that may seem like a win, the violence hasn't stopped. It's just harder to predict and impossible to control. The SDs may never vanish completely, but they also may never rise again in the way they once did. Too many betrayals, too much blood, and too few people left who remember what the gang used to stand for. What remains is chaos wearing the same colors. There's no legend in the way this story ends. No grand finale, just empty corners, quiet grudges, and lives left undone. And if the name still echoes, it does so in silence. Appreciate you watching. If you enjoyed it, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe for more.